she and she's going to be she's working on coastal pitch pine. She did her undergraduate work at Dickinson College in Pennsylvania, and then is now doing her PhD work, and this will be a part of the PhD work at the University of New Hampshire. And so we're lucky to get her to come up and study something that actually like literally keeps us up sometimes at night, thinking about what might our pitch pine be facing here in the not too distant future. And so look, thank you for coming and look forward to learning more.
All right, thanks. So to start off, I actually have many thanks to give. So as Abe said, I'm here through Second Century Stewardship, so really grateful for that support financially and logistically from everyone involved. And then I have my mentors and like people who are guiding this work. And so that's Jeff Garnis and Mark Ducey at UNH, University of New Hampshire, and Jesse Wheeler here at Acadia. And then it's actually going to be a multi-park partnership. So I'm working with Steve Smith at Cape Cod and Jordan Raphael at Fire Island. So not going to talk too much about those places today. We're going to keep it focused on Acadia, but just know that this work will happen in a bunch of other spaces as well. And so, especially since Catherine's here, I've met a bunch of you at the science communication training, and I've been thinking a lot about science as storytelling. And so I want to set this up as a story today about trees and beetles and people. And so I'll bring each of those characters in my introduction, and then I'll get into more of my methods and exactly what I've designed with these various components. And my other thing I wanted to say here is that I do a lot of teaching, and I always tell my students, like, you expect me to come to class prepared, and here I am with this stuff for you. And so I just ask that, you know, if you have questions, bring them up when it's time, you know, don't hold back, because it'll be a lot more fun if we have things to talk about at the end. And so to begin, I want to kind of ground us in these dry pine forests of the Northeast. And so here I have two somewhat different landscapes, but they're both here in the state of Maine, and they're both dominated by pitch pine. And in the southern US, we might see this with shortleaf pine or loblolly pine or other hard pines, but generally these are dry sites. They usually have a sandy soil, more inland. And then around here, we often see these trees growing directly out of rocks pretty much. And the forest floor is often covered with blueberry and huckleberry and other heath plants and lichens. And so if you've been hiking around Acadia, I know many of you are, so you're very familiar with this ecosystem, I bet. But I also want to introduce specifically the pitch pine, which is our tree of importance for me and this study, and I know for a bunch of you too. So the scientific name is Pinus rigida. It has 3 needles. Here in Acadia, it has more of a dwarf growth form a lot of times, so pretty short, not that much taller than us. But it can get very tall, especially inland. You know, I've seen some that are, you know, just as big as your average white pine sometimes. And fun fact, when I did a Wikipedia search for the forest fire of 1947, pitch pine is described as the undesirable tree species that came up after the fire. And so I'll talk about the fire a couple of times, but I thought it was a little rude. And so let's just like take it back a step and let's appreciate the pitch pine here for this hour. And so this is a pretty cool tree, not just because I like it and it's here in Acadia, but it's actually pretty rare on the landscape. And so what I'm showing here are 2 maps of interior pine barrens and coastal plain pitch pine barrens. And Acadia doesn't even show up on these maps from the Nature Conservancy, not sure why. But what I want you to take away from this is that these pitch pine dominated habitats are pretty rare in the landscape. Those little green splotches are pretty much all we've got. And these are a pretty rare forest type, and they have rare flora and fauna that live within them, especially moths and butterflies. Birds have been studied, small wildflowers have been studied here, and I'm sure that there's more things that we're missing as well. And so not only is this habitat important here in Acadia, but it's also important all throughout its range, just due to the relative rarity of the habitat. But of course, I'm going to talk about what makes pitch pine in Acadia so special. We are here at the very northern edge of this tree's range. And so in general, I think it's really interesting to study anything at its range edge. You would expect different species to be experiencing different environmental stressors or competition stressors at either a northern or a southern range edge. And these coastal trees also experience a maritime climate, which means they might be getting salt stressed, especially if they're right up against the coast and getting, hit by waves and salt spray. And then there's also interesting conditions here with warmer winters that you would experience inland at times. I know we have pitch pine on summits, but at the same time, here in Acadia, it can be warmer sometimes than it is further inland where there's more snow. And at the same time, the Gulf of Maine is warming faster, and this region is warming faster than many others. So that presents this interesting climatic future that will impact pitch pines here and elsewhere as well. And I already mentioned the dwarf growth form, which is the hardest 3 words to say. That's pretty interesting and unique to those trees here in Acadia. Many other places that are like Rocky Mountain tops or coastal pitch pines, those often have that kind of growth form, but in terms of here in Maine, it's pretty unique. And just to illustrate one more time, these trees are iconic on our summits here, especially on Dore and Champlain here in the east, and then on Norumbega and Acadia Mountains. As far as I'm aware, and I'd love to hear other places where you can really get into the pitch pine habitat, but those are the ones that I pulled out for the talk here today. And so I've introduced our tree, and now I'm going to introduce our beetle. And so this is the southern pine beetle, or SPD. And I have the scale bar over there, and I'm going to show you in a minute just how tiny they are. They're tiny beetles with a huge impact, and I'll try to get into just enough of the southern pine beetle biology for the talk, and then we can always get into more questions afterwards. But the scientific name of this species is Dendroctonus frontalis, and Dendroctonus means tree killer in Greek. So it's very appropriate because they mass attack healthy pine trees. And other members of the genus Dendroctonus include mountain pine beetles. So you've heard about that kind of damage happening in the Western US and Canada. It's a very similar system. And especially in the Southern US, where Southern pine beetle has been studied for like over 100 years, there's a huge economic impact of Southern pine beetle killed trees in that people are planting shortleaf and loblolly pine as their livelihood. So when they lose all of that timber, it's a huge loss on a personal level. But then in terms of the ecology, these trees are dying within a matter of weeks to months once Southern pine beetles attack the tree. So it's a very quick ecological change. We see a lot of really interesting vegetation and animal patterns after Southern pine beetle trees are fully dead. So it's a really interesting kind of human and landscape interaction there with these attacks. And I want to point out, this is a beetle that is native to North America. So, as opposed to other forest, I don't want to say forest pests, I kind of have a weird thing about that. But in terms of other forest insects and pathogens that are invasive that maybe have been brought over or are transferred via firewood, this is not an invasive species per se. This is not something that has been human vectored that we know of. It could be human vectored, but that's not really what we're seeing the most of. So it's a native species. And it is really tiny. So that is one beetle in my hand. And I think in the same way that, trees and plants are really fascinating to study, even though these beetles are killing trees that many of us love, they're super fascinating on how they can actually carry out this kind of damage in a really short time. And so I'm going to get into exactly how they're doing this next. So they mass attack healthy trees, and that just means that there's many of them going to one tree. And this is, oh, interesting. I'm going to pause the video. Yeah. Maybe that's what's going on. Interesting. I'm pressing pause, but it's not doing anything. Oh, there you go. Okay. Okay. Sorry, I was
You know what's totally funny is, so online is fine.
It's fine online. Okay. All right, well, just gonna image you in the room here, we have trees that are attacked by southern pine beetle, and they have these little pitch globs all over them. And so that's the tree defending itself against the southern pine beetle attack. And when you're walking around in the forest, that's what you're going to see before you see any of the needles dying or other signs of tree decline. What I'm showing here on the right, well, if you can see the video, it's a video of a southern pine beetle swimming through the pitch, which I think is really amazing. Because like if you ever cut down an evergreen tree for any reason, like Christmas tree or just yard work, you know, if you get pitch on your pants or on your hands, it's super sticky and annoying. Yeah.
It just,
Maybe it's not your thing.
no.
Okay.
See if it helps with the
Let's-
next slide.
yeah. So the next thing I wanted to say is that, oh no.
Here.
I know. They don't want us to know their secret.
Would it have like a gel that they secrete or something that goes around their system? Is there something that allows them to?
No. It is just like, they're just strong and resilient. So, I'm not gonna press the back button. Sorry, guys. I only have one other video. If that doesn't work, we'll just skip through that one. But so what I wanted to point out here is that, I'm quoting this scientist in the mountain pine beetle system, Diana Six, and she has a great TED talk. You should watch it. But she says trees are dangerous. And so I just wanted to really drive home the point that even though trees are stationary, this is like totally taking it all from Diana in her TED talk. Trees are stationary, but yet they're really fighting back against pests and pathogens whenever they can. And so the exuding of the pitch or the resin for these pine trees is their way of defending themselves. And the way that the beetles are overcoming that is often by exhausting that defense. So if enough beetles are coming to the tree, enough resin is coming out, and the tree is kind of like an exhauster. I like to think about it in terms of, I have the 1,000 mosquito bites hypothesis, where it's like, if you got 10 mosquito bites in one day, that would be annoying. But if you got over 1,000 at the same time, your body might respond differently. I've never heard of anyone who's had this phenomenon happen to them. So I'm not sure if it's actually a good analogy or not, but just imagine the way the body could respond. So trees are dangerous, they're defending themselves. And if they are unsuccessful in defending themselves, here's what's going to happen. So on the right side of the screen, we have a cross section of a tree. And so the beetles are boring into the outer bark, and they're making their way to the phloem layer, which is like a spongy, sugary layer in between the bark and the wood. So as opposed to things like emerald ash borer that are going all the way into the wood, the beetles are staying out here, which is a relatively small space. And underneath the bark, what they're doing in that phloem layer is they are, on the left-hand side here, you can see a piece of the bark is peeled off of the tree. And the southern pine beetle galleries, or the little tunnels where they lay eggs, are these dark kind of sinusoidal galleries, we call them. There's evidence of other bark beetle activities in this piece of bark, but for now we're just illustrating how the southern pine beetles are actually kind of mining their way through the phloem. And so this is their food resource. It's pretty sugary in terms of other parts of the tree. That's where they'll mate, they'll lay their eggs, and then the larvae hatch, they kind of crawl around in the phloem layer, and then they'll pupate in that outer bark and exit the tree to carry on the cycle. And so in terms of southern pine beetle biology, one of the things that's not tree related that's really important is the temperature on the coldest night of the year. This determines how many southern pine beetles are going to survive the winter and can give us an indication of what the southern pine beetle risk will be the coming spring, summer, and fall. And so what I'm showing over here is a graph of minimum winter temperatures, and I have Celsius on the bottom and Fahrenheit on the top. I mean, I usually think in Fahrenheit, but I have to write in Celsius, so I like having both of those things there. And then on the left axis, we see southern pine beetle mortality. So over here, when we're at just about freezing, no beetles are dying, 0% mortality. But what I'm showing here with this point, with the dotted line and line, is that at about -7 Fahrenheit, -22 Celsius, we would expect 90% of the beetles to die in the winter. And so what I like in this too is just kind of like our temperature tolerance. Like we're all sitting here in the same room, same temperature. Maybe somebody thinks it's hot, maybe somebody thinks it's cold. And so the beetles have a similar response where at any given temperature, I can't tell you which beetles are going to die or how many beetles are going to die. But we know that proportionally, some of them will die earlier than others. And so the colder it gets on that coldest night of the year, it does not have to be for very long, a couple hours, just enough. It's really about this like freezing crystal that occurs in their body. If we can get down below -7, things are pretty good. Yes.
So is this why they're not, this is like the northern part of the area, because then it ends up being that they hit that freeze point.
Yeah, I have a range map coming up that'll delineate that a little bit more, but so I'll come back to the temperature piece, but this is a climate change story, right? As winter is warm and climate changes, we'll see southern pine beetle and other insects in different places. Yes. That is what we are thinking. So other bark beetles, especially in the northern parts of their range, some of them exit the tree and go into the soil layer for the winter, but no one has ever observed that in southern pine beetles yet.
So it's really not the outside temperature, the temperature.
Right, yes. There is work on that differential between outer temperature and inner bark temperature, and the buffering doesn't seem to be that big of a deal. But it is taken into account in these temperature models. Great questions. I want to briefly jump into how people fit into this equation. I've kind of already touched on it a little bit. But we have forest managers and forest landowners who are faced with really difficult decisions and difficult situations when southern pine beetle is found in their forest. But then there's also people, and this is much more broad, right? This is impacting a lot more people when we think about people who recreate or just visit these forests. And that could be a place here like Acadia, which can be like a destination for people that are coming on vacation. But in my research on Long Island, I was really interacting with people who, like, this was their local park where they walk their dog every day. And in a space like that, there's really not many other kinds of places like that where you can walk in the forest. Most forests down there are pitch pine. So we're really impacting a lot of just everyday people who are looking for refuge from the shade, just looking to get outside. And the other people that are involved that I pulled out for today's talk are the researchers. And so there's been over 100 years of southern pine beetle research since like the late 1890s when people started really complaining about trees that were dying. I don't have a lot of information about kind of like pre-colonial interactions with southern pine beetle, but if anybody did have that kind of information, I'm so interested. And so in this research sphere, that's where I come in, and I have a little extended introduction for myself here. I'm a PhD candidate in Earth and Environmental Sciences at UNH, and my advisor is Jeff Garnis, who studied European fire ants here in Acadia for his master's at University of Maine. So he wanted me to say that to say hello to anybody who remembers him. Oh, cool, awesome. I'll let him know. And so I consider myself to be a community ecologist. I'm really interested in how these different things fit together, the plants and the trees and the people and the climate. And I'm doing that in this forest entomology context, forest insects. I'm not from New England, I'm from Pennsylvania, but I've lived in New Hampshire for the past 6 years, so I'm getting there a little bit. And you already know I'm working with second century stewardship. And just to kind of briefly go over my PhD research and how I'm seeing it all shape up, I have about 2 years to go, so I have some things that will still change a little bit. But what I'm thinking about is responses to the southern pine beetle. I'm thinking about the insect community that will respond to southern pine beetle. There's all kinds of predators and parasitoids that are going to attack southern pine beetle, eat the eggs, the larvae, or the adults. And I've been doing this using chemical ecology, so putting out synthetic southern pine beetle pheromones and seeing what other insects are coming to those traps. And I'm doing this in places where we don't have southern pine beetles, so it's like extra interesting. And I also want to know how these pitch pines are responding when southern pine beetle is in the system, because most of the research on southern pine beetle has been done in the southern US where we don't have much pitch pine, right? The range kind of extends into like maybe Georgia and Tennessee, but don't quote me on that right now. In any case, we want to know kind of what is the trajectory of tree decline that's specific to pitch pine. So I've been using drones to detect southern pine beetle needle color change before our eyes can see it. So there's kind of this progression from green to yellow to red. But if you can detect trees that are attacked when the needles are green, it would be really cool and really important. And lastly, how I see this project shaping up is thinking about how will we respond to southern pine beetle in this new place. And so that's why I'm doing this risk assessment in Northeastern National Park Service lands, and that includes Fire Island and Cape Cod as well as Acadia. And so that range map I mentioned, so southern pine beetle, the red spots here on the left are the places where southern pine beetle has been found prior to like 1920, 1930. So the western edge of this southern range is really dictated by like, where are trees? We've kind of transitioned into more of a grassland landscape there to the west. But to the north, it's been thought for a very long time to just be about temperature. There's also these populations in like Arizona and Mexico, Central America. Those are kind of different, kind of the same, different host trees, kind of different genetic stuff going on, and a lot less research happening in those places. But in general, we know that southern pine beetle can survive further north with warming winters. And I have 3 arrows here. So that bottom arrow is pointing to Long Island, where southern pine beetle outbreaks were detected in 2014 for the first time. Southern pine beetle outbreaks have been reported in the New Jersey pine barrens, even back in the 1910s, 1920s. But really, they kind of took off in the early 2000s. And then in 2014, we found them on Long Island. And then once that outbreak was discovered or identified, then a bunch of trapping occurred in the New England states. And so that happened in like 2014, 15, 16, and it continues to today to keep the pulse on where the beetles are. But even from the very early days, 2015, individual beetles were found in Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts. And so as part of the first chapter of my PhD, which I totally had to redo because of COVID, don't recommend starting a PhD during a pandemic, but here I am. I couldn't go more than 2 hours away from my university in 2020. And so I said, okay, let's take southern pine beetle pheromones, place them out in these different forest locations in southern Maine and parts of New Hampshire and Massachusetts, where we have never captured southern pine beetle, to see what community members would come to the pheromones in a place where there's no southern pine beetle. And I found southern pine beetle. And it was terrible. No, it was a really interesting, concerning time. And I found southern pine beetles in Waterboro, Maine. So that's in York County. That was the furthest north here in Maine. And then I found them in Ossipee, New Hampshire. So just at kind of the very beginning of the White Mountains. And it gets pretty cold there. So that was a really interesting find. But so actually that's how I'm here today, is that somebody at my school wanted to pitch the idea that I found southern pine beetle to Maine Public Radio. And then through a series of events, Catherine Schmidt contacted me for Northern Woodlands to do a quick article. And then she's like, hey, you should study pitch pine in Acadia. It'd be cool. And then I found out about the program, and here I am today. So thank you to Catherine so much. And along with that discovery, I just published my first author paper, which was really, really cool, about the fact that I found southern pine beetle in New Hampshire and Maine. And we also collaborated with folks from New York Department of Environmental Conservation, and they're finding southern pine beetles like up in Saratoga, that northern dots in New York. That's further north than they've ever found them before in New York. So I have the location of the furthest north outbreak on Long Island here, and then we're kind of way up there where that other arrow is ish. here in Acadia. And this, I did not publish this figure, so you guys get a little special look. And so that's very concerning news, but there is some good news. And that's that southern pine beetles only kill trees in an outbreak. So detecting, like I detected maybe 50 beetles. And that suggests we're in an endemic phase, not the outbreak phase. And the good news is that there's time to take action when we have a population this small. So that's kind of underlying a lot of my work here in New England, is that we kind of have this signal that something is happening, but we do have time before those populations get really big to learn more about our trees here, learn more about our landscape, so we can make good decisions about what to do next. And so previous research in the southern US has identified some risk factors for southern pine beetle attack. And the two big things are basal area and stand density. So basal area is like how much of the ground is covered with like the circular part of the tree. And in the south, they're saying, oh, less than 100 square feet per acre, or 23 meters squared per hectare, you should be good. But then recent work through E.J. Jameson at UVM, she studied pitch pine barrens in like Long Island and Cape Cod, and she found that about 15 square meters of basal area per hectare was a better metric to use. And then in terms of stand density, we're just concerned about the number of trees per acre or per hectare for whatever area we're concerned about. Other risk factors have been identified, like moisture, which we're not really concerned about. Dry sites right now, I understand. The age of the stand and soil type and texture have also been identified as things that can change the risk of southern pine beetle in place. And so just to kind of really make this simple, how big are these trees and are they close together? And the way that I think about this is just like, what is the probability that as a beetle, here's your tree, the beetle is going to exit the tree once it's done pupating. What's the probability that that beetle is going to hit an appropriate host? It's not really good at seeing things. We often put out these traps that are just like dark black in color, and they're vertical, and that's kind of tree shaped to them. So they're not that good at seeing things. It takes a lot of energy to figure out if you are finding an appropriate host. And so when we think about how big trees are and their orientation, that's a big fact that really plays into, will southern pine beetle find these trees easily or not? My other analogy I used the other day was, is this a buffet where you can hop from like plate to plate and like gather all these food resources? Or is this like driving down the highway and you see your rest stop with snacks and you need to stop now because you have no idea when your next meal is going to be? So from here, I designed a study here in Acadia, Fire Island, Cape Cod. That's pretty simple, actually. But of course, it gets way more complicated. First, I need to locate the pitch pines. I need to measure these trees, and I'm also setting up temperature loggers. Kind of encapsulating all that information all the background I just introduced about there needs to be trees. We know they need to be a certain size, probably to be attacked by southern pine beetle, and then the beetles need to be able to survive the winter to remain a threat. So what I did was I went to the IRMA website. I don't know if that's what you guys call it. You call it IRMA, IRMA.
Sure.
And I found this wonderful vegetation mapping inventory project. So I downloaded that information and I said, I just care about areas where we know there's pitch pine. And then I got this map. So I have these different polygons or these different areas. I know how big they are. And generally on the right here, I have these areas, or what I'm calling these different polygons in general. And so then I said, okay, for every approximately 2 acres of pitch pine habitat, I want to assign a random sampling point. And so I had ArcGIS put all these points, all of these polygons for me, and I'll get to exactly how that went in a minute. But if you're interested, how does pitch pine habitat relate to the fire of 1947? It relates pretty darn well. Over on Eastern MDI, I know there's some kind of outliers over here, but that's not to say there's not fire history in those areas. I do have some of that information, but it wasn't as pretty to map. So just wanted to put that up there for curiosity's sake. And so when I'm out there in the field, I designed this project to be really simple because it's just me. And I want it to be low impact on the environment, because as I'm sure some of you know, there's really cool rare plants in these places, they're easily trampled. And I didn't want to have to like lay out a 10 by 10 meter plot and then identify everything within the plot. That would take a lot of time and effort. And so what I'm doing is more of a forestry protocol using optical angle gauge or a prism. So literally, sometimes I joke around like, yes, this whole project revolves around this little crystal of glass. But basically, I have the next slide is all about the prism, but it tells me which trees I should sample or not in a given area based on their size. And so then once I know which trees I'm sampling, I record the tree species, the diameter, breast height, and the distance to plot center. And I have some of my materials here. I can tell you exactly how I do those things if it's interesting to you. And then the last piece that I kind of threw in there was hemispherical photography. So it's literally 30 seconds, and that's why I'm doing it. But I take a hemispherical photo of the canopy. So at a given height and making sure this is totally level, just taking a picture facing up, and I'll show you some of those photos in a minute. And the openness or closure of the canopy, I think, can tell us something about how well the southern pine beetle pheromones will remain in the system. You know, if it's really easy for it to stay within the canopy or below, that signal for the beetles to talk to each other and tell each other where there's a good tree, I think could be potentially skewed. So the prism sampling, I found some really great images online, but what it comes down to is a variable radius plot. And so each tree kind of has this bubble around it, that the radius of the bubble is proportional to its size. And what the prism is doing is you're standing in one place, you're looking at these different trees, and what the prism is doing is distorting the tree in the prism's view. So that way, if it's totally disjointed, like looking through a glass of water and things are weird behind it, if it's totally disjointed, that's not in your plot. If it's somewhat connected, it's in your plot. And if it's on the edge, well, this one's saying to count every other tree, that's like, I want to be more precise than that. So that's why I'm also recording the distance to plot center. And there's all kinds of mathematical equations that are behind this work. But basically, if you know the size of the tree and you know the distance to the plot center, you know for sure whether you should count that tree or not. So that I can explain that more. You can play around with this stuff in a little bit. It is kind of confusing, but once you know the math, it all makes sense. We're not going to spend time doing that today, though. Then I want to say, I brought up this familiar idea to describe potentially trails as transects, and I talked to Caitlin McDonough-McKenzie about this. There were some places where getting to my random sampling points either was like dangerous for me, or I was like, I'm not walking over Broom Crowberry, like no. And so then I was like, well, we can potentially assume that trails traverse or cut through these polygons in a way that could be considered somewhat random. You know, like they didn't construct a trail to, hit different trees in different places. And so what I had been doing was hiking a trail in one direction, noting where there's pitch pine, like at the beginning of my hike and towards the end, and then turning around, breaking the segment into chunks, and then sampling at those chunks. And so what this looks like, and I could talk more about kind of the trails as transects approach in general, but I know you've been involved in that work. Caitlin used it to document and record phenology of flowering plants in the springtime. And I haven't seen it used in forestry yet, so this will be kind of an interesting test here. But basically, so on this particular day, I hiked up Champlain, and my polygon told me that there was going to be no pitch pine until I got to like here. And you step onto that trail, and if you know what a pitch pine looks like, you would say to yourself, no, that's not right. And so I said, wow, this is a great time to use this approach because I don't have a way to randomly sample an area that I don't know how big it is. So I walked to the top. I figured out it was about 1 mile, I think, however much it was. Then I actually used my watch to, I told it I was doing a track workout and I wanted to tell me every 100 meters to stop. And it did. And then I used the random number generator to say, should I go to the right or to the left of the trail? And this way I was able to cover a lot more ground because you're walking mostly on trails and not bushwhacking all the time. And I just felt better about not having to step on plants, so. I'm also gonna use this, there are some places where I know there's pitch pine that were not included in the polygon data set. So I'll be able to, you know, hike those trails and then sample in this way. So that's the secondary approach that was, you know, call your advisor on the top of a mountain kind of thing. If you know, you know.
Are you trying to sample all of the pitch pine park, the populations in the park?
Yes, yes. It's been a big undertaking, but I'm almost there. So about 3 weeks in. And then the piece that I haven't done yet is putting out these temperature loggers. They will record the temperature every single hour for a whole year or until they die, just about. And I really care about the temperature in the winter, so I'm not concerned about them dying before you know, my important temperatures are recorded. And so it's pretty small item there. And then I'm playing around with exactly how I'm going to house them and protect them. But you might see something like that. I've seen a couple of those throughout the park, little UV cover things. So they'll be out there and they'll be tagged. So that's happening soon. And I have my potential sites chosen, and I'm gonna run those by you guys in a minute. Next, I have a video of the hemispherical photos. So we'll see if this is gonna work out. Nope, it's not gonna work, but it might work for the people online. Actually, it is somewhat working here. So I have not analyzed these at all. But I just wanted to show you how different some of these different sites looked. And so we're just kind of, what my computer program is going to do is like systematically look at these and say how much sky is visible or not. And so like you can see it is quite variable throughout some of my different sampling points. I just pulled out a couple. One thing you can notice is that the blue sky is never visible except for there. I brought the fog, I swear. But so it'll be interesting how that all plays out. Yes.
Are all those photo points away from the trail?
Yes.
Because the trails get maintained.
Right, yes, and you would expect that, you know, a tree is never going to grow in the middle of a certain, right, yes, so I don't think, yeah, we have no sampling points on a trail per se, but maybe adjacent or, you know, a couple meters off, so. Yeah. So
Make great Christmas ornaments.
I know,
Make them really
they're
tall.
beautiful. I'm thinking about, yeah, like making some like Instagram stuff, I don't know.
No, good.
You know, all right,
Can I ask a question?
please.
How are these beetles getting here?
How are they gonna get here? So they fly. They don't fly very far as an individual. So, you know, exactly how did the beetles get to like Waterboro and Ossipee? I don't know. In the mountain pine beetle landscape, we understand wind patterns in the west a lot more. I think something with humidity, there's a temperature and like wind thing, but like they've been carried like miles and miles in the west. We don't know exactly how far the wind can carry them in the east. Transportation of firewood, if someone has a pitch pine like on Cape Cod, and they're bringing firewood here, that is a possibility, but I don't think it's super likely just in terms of popular firewood species. So one thing that I've heard, basically, I'm the first person that was like weird enough to look for southern pine beetles in the fall in New England. No one's ever done that before. And we'll say it's because I'm a PhD student. People are like, yeah, go ahead, go do it. And so I can't tell you if southern pine beetle has just come to like New Hampshire and Maine for the first time, or if we keep missing it. So it's possible that there are these individual beetles in these small places that can kind of travel northward more. But I wish I knew. I'm getting to the end here, but my current project status, I have most of the polygons in Acadia sampled. I'm going to I'm going to Fire Island in August, going to Idaho next week. I really just need to finish up sampling on Door this week. And then Cape Cod, I'm working on a plan for setting up the temperature loggers this fall and maybe coming back in the spring to do my tree measurements. And so I have to come back here next summer to pick up my temperature loggers. And so there is opportunity for me to, try some new things or add to the data set if I need to. And here in Acadia, I'm thinking about placing my temperature loggers on Door and Champlain because they have the most pitch pine, according to the data set. Wonderland because it's very unique and kind of very far removed from that eastern MDI mountainous area. Isle Ho, again, because it's kind of far removed and by itself. And then I have one more logger that I don't know. I mean, I have places I could put it, but I am interested in hearing from any of you what places you would prioritize in that very small number of loggers. You can think about it.
Maybe since they put, I guess it's just more of the whole of the study, but what about Jack Pine?
That's a great question. So I chose to not sample jack pine, just to keep things a little simpler. And also because, jack pine is mostly on Scudic, and there's kind of that divide between MDI and Scudic that would at least allow for, if southern pine beetle is detected on MDI, there may be still, time for it to get to Scudic. But we could put one on Scudic.
Or Jack Pine on the MDI.
True, yeah, South Ridge of Cadillac, yeah.
Catherine is
Yes.
suggesting Acadia Mountain. Do you want to unmute yourself and say what you're thinking, Catherine?
Sure. I do agree that Scudic could be interesting. But I was just wondering if Acadia Mountain would be a potential spot because of the bare oaks.
That,
Which
yeah.
are- yeah.
That would be a really cool one for sure. The other spot I was thinking about was potentially Norumbega because it's kind of more central, I guess, between Wonderland and Door and Champlain. And has pitch pine. So, but yeah, the bare oaks are really cool. Yeah.
There are some south of Cadillac.
Okay. I wasn't looking for them, so.
There's somewhere else.
Yeah. So I'm gonna wrap up what I have prepared. And so I just wanted to say at the end here, there's more to the story. Please ask me a lot of questions. There's obviously a lot of things I had to leave out, but I also have questions for you. And so we kind of already got to some of those, but yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
So questions, yeah.
Like, so I guess obviously we're talking about pine trees and growings, the higher places, but what about what pines they're growing within them?
Yeah, so white pine can be attacked by southern pine beetle. It's largely thought to be a sink, so they rarely reproduce that we know of in white pine. But that's not to say that, a dying white pine wouldn't make a great home for southern pine beetles in between outbreak phases. Yeah. I will say, so sorry, I'm just gonna remember, but the in my pheromone prepping study, I had sites that were pitch pine dominated and white pine dominated within close proximity. And I don't think I captured any southern pine beetles in the white pine sites, only pitch pine.
This specific question. Can you talk more about the what happens at -7 to the beetles?
So I have not seen this, I have not studied this part, but basically, from my understanding, when you're doing a freezing study, basically they're looking for this like puff of heat that basically is the transformation from like liquid to solid in terms of like their hemolyths or like their blood kind of, and it like crystallizes, I guess.
So it's the freezing point for the what is it, the hemolymph?
Yeah, kind of like the antifreeze for their bodies. Yeah.
Is at -7, so that's.
Well, so, it's around -7, right? Like depending on the individual, maybe it's
Okay.
about their like fat content or like, the thickness of their exoskeleton or something. Yeah, but that would be a really cool thing to study.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I thought he was glycosurgeon, so I hadn't used to in the past.
Yes, yeah.
So there's a lot of southern pines, and I assume they're distributed over a very wide area.
here we're talking about a very limited resource.
Yeah.
What do you see as the risks to this resource as opposed to the south, where trees have adapted to pine beetle outbreaks here and there?
Yeah.
And with other places and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, I mean, for me, the biggest risk that I see is like losing the pine barrens as an ecosystem, especially in the absence of fires in this region. And, you know, for like, I say that with like no judgment, because the Northeast is so populated compared to places in the South that how could you do a prescribed burn in some of these places without risk to human health or, you know, belongings? And yeah, I guess the maintenance of the pine barrens is something that I'm really interested in, and how we can kind of maintain this ecosystem, given the constraints that we have in terms of fire in a lot of these places.
Are you looking at it?
I'm- Right, I am not looking at it. I am noting when I see Pitch Pine region. It's been nice to see here, especially compared to some of the other places I've studied. I haven't seen too much, so. Yes.
So one of your questions, there's each mile on sense of your, which is the one right next to you.
Mhm.
This is section that burn.
Yes, yeah, I don't know, somebody here probably knows Mike Simmons from UNH who studied red pine scale. He had some different plot data from his red pine studies, so he sent me places where he knew there were pitch pine, so St. Severe is on my list of the trails as transects approach for sure. Yeah, thank you. Yes.
You said you were doing the trapping in the fall.
So I was doing trapping in the fall in southern Maine, in parts of New Hampshire, and that's really odd. So, you know, you usually trap for southern pine beetles in the spring, where they're going to do this kind of big emergence where the beetles are going to come out of their like native, like home tree. They're going to try to go far away to start infestation. And, you know, typically people say it's like when the dogwoods are blooming in the south, that's the time you should be trapping in like southern pine beetle. What I think is happening is going back to the temperature curve. If 90% of the beetles are dying over the winter, they might need some time to build their population back up to a detectable level for us. And so that's why I think that I found southern pine beetle in the fall in these regions. It's either that or they're like moving up the coast every year, dying up here, and then it just keeps happening again and again. I'm not sure.
And when you were doing your trapping, did you find any of the, beetles that made on them?
Yeah, a lot of them. So, so for my master's, I studied southern pine beetle communities on Long Island, which never been done before. We're publishing that work now. And basically, generally the community members are all there, especially like the major predatory beetle there. I found fewer parasitoids, but with my trapping study, you really can't get at parasitoids so much. But we have found a lot of predators here, including some ones that I don't usually capture on them. So. I have not. There's some folks in the Forest Service in Durham who are doing some DNA stuff. Durham and Hunter, but I haven't done that.
So knowing what you know now, if you were to read this study, would there be something that could be differently?
Yeah.
Not have COVID hit, right?
Yeah. Yeah. COVID would be, you know, actually I got COVID in the field last summer, not here, but that was not fun. What I do differently? Not have it rain every day because I can't take my equipment out in the pouring rain. I don't know. I guess I'm not sure yet. I'll probably know more when I'm looking at the data and then thinking, oh, I should have measured that.
So one of the questions in your dissertation is how are we going to respond? How are you planning on doing that part of your dissertation?
That's a great question. I don't have that piece
Oh.
figured out yet. Yeah. This chapter, you know, I figured out that I got funded in like February. So I kind of have a full dissertation without it. And then kind of adding this in, I was thinking about like, how do I bring in this project and tie it together? So I have a lot more to think about in terms of just making it a cohesive narrative. That's what I'm working on for now.
I'm guessing that we and Jesse would be glad to. Work with you.
Yeah, I love that.
We're asking that question too.
So I maybe said this at the beginning, but the southern pines, are they fully adapted to it?
No, they're not. You know, they're seemingly just as susceptible as the ones up here. I mean, pitch pine is still prevalent in the native range of southern pine beetle. It's just not as common, well, especially when like we as humans are planting, you know, shortleaf and loblolly all the time. Yeah, the whole like tree.
Which one of the effects or whatever they sort of get from?
There are some tree types that are more susceptible than others. There is some information about, you know, thickness of the bark and what that means for parasitoids and resin defenses, which trees, like even though pitch pine, it's called pitch pine, it's actually not the biggest resin producer, which I thought was really weird. What is, it was either loblolly or shortleaf with a lot more resin. But for part of my comprehensive exam, I had this question about like, can we prove coevolution of bark beetles and trees? And we can't prove it, but like, it seems very interesting that the trees that get attacked by bark beetles are the trees that can produce resins, right? Like apple trees and maple trees don't get attacked by bark beetles so much. So this has an example.
So this is a native pest and
Yeah.
native trees.
Mhm.
What has interrupted the relationship between them that they now become pests? Is it related to agri farming of huge stands of loblolly and broadleaf or what?
I don't know.
Or is it just that, you know, this isn't just, you call it just because it's native, it's not gonna be a bad thing?
I think that's part of it. I have read some things. So like, you know, 1700s, these like Moravian monks in the Carolinas were like, there's a black magic in the woods and it's killing the trees. And we think that it was southern pine beetle. There's like stories of like settlers on like the western front, like cutting down bark beetle killed trees and like putting it in a forest that they wanted to kill so they could plant crops, you know. So I don't know, you know, what the relationship has been between southern pine beetle and trees for a very long time, but maybe it's some kind of like natural thinning role that it plays in the forest, because I think something that's interesting that in the pine beetle management world, these pitch pine barrens are often kind of more savanna looking, like you've got trees, like all these grasses and bushes, not all these trees close together like you might see, especially in the interior pine barrens. They can get quite dense. And so maybe this is something about you know, patterns of trees in the landscape, and if we keep the basal area lower, we'll keep the beetles away. But the beetles will be there no matter what. It's just kind of, there's this really interesting paper and figure that's like about these two stable states, right? So we have like, there's the endemic phase and the beetles are fine, they're just doing their thing in endemic phase. There's outbreak phase, and that's one mode. What causes the shift between the two? There's a lot of theories, but there's no like hard and fast answer. So, sorry,
One more question, so
Yeah.
this will be the last.
I can hang around if people have time. And also I have contact info to share with you, but yes.
I can also ask it, it's a little bit.
Okay.
I was just curious more about like the outbreak phases themselves. I know you just said that we don't have too much, but is it a seasonal thing? Is it like reproductive, like?
Yes,
Time in between outbreaks, like what? Do you know about?
there are patterns and I can like share that with you. I don't have that off the top of my head, but so the beetles and their developmental cycle, it changes depending on the temperature. So like on Long Island, we think that there's about 3 generations per year. You know, like in Louisiana, there could be 10. And it's all about how warm it is during the growing season. And I mean, the beetles will be active on any day it's warm enough for them. So like we've seen beetles flying on Long Island, like around New Year's, when it's, you know, in the 50s on a weird day. And that's very different from the mountain pine beetle system. In mountain pine beetle, there's like 1 or 2 generations per year. The 2 things like move. But so the fact that there's so many generations per year, it allows southern pine beetles to really, cause that mortality in a quick way, which is really hard for us to respond to.
Well, thank you very much.
You're very welcome. So please, I have my email here. I'm happy to share the slides, if there's a way for me to do that with people. And I also just started a science Instagram. So it's CK_sci. So like yesterday, you could have seen me freak out about seeing my first ever starfish. So it'll be about this project, but also other cool science things, if you're into that. So thank you so much for your attention.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Also, are there any chats I should see or that we didn't get to?
That was it.
Okay.